Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at one of the most famous works of Russian literature,
Oh, yeah.
Crime and Punishment by Fyodor Dostoevsky.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. We're going to try to help you understand it better,
Yeah,
whether you're reading it for class or just curious about what makes it so famous.
definitely.
And honestly, just that title alone, Crime and Punishment,
Yeah, it grabs you.
it grabs you, right?
It does. It really sets the stage, I think, for the whole book.
it-
It's not just a random title.
It's like the core struggle of our main character, right?
Absolutely. It's the core struggle of Rodion Raskolnikov.
Rodion Raskolnikov.
Yes.
I feel like I'm going to be saying that name a lot.
Now, it's a mouthful, but you get used to it.
So can you tell us a little bit about Rodion?
So Rodion, he's a young man living in 19th century St. Petersburg, and he's not a hardened criminal.
Nope.
He's actually a former student who's really struggling with poverty and some very intense ideas.
So what kind of ideas are we talking about here?
Well, he's grappling with this dangerous philosophy.
Right.
The idea that certain people, the extraordinary ones, are above conventional morality.
Above the law, you mean?
Well, not exactly law, but more like the moral constraints that bind ordinary people. He believes these extraordinary figures have the right to, let's say, transgress those boundaries for a greater good.
Oh, so almost like a Robin Hood complex, but like way more messed up.
Yes, exactly. And this is where the pawnbroker comes in. This elderly woman who is known for being very miserly, she becomes a sort of test case for Rodion's theory.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think everyone listening is probably wondering the same thing I'm wondering right now.
Oh, I think so.
Does he actually commit a crime?
He does. He murders the pawnbroker. Dostoevsky doesn't shy away from the brutal details of the act at all.
Wow.
And you as a reader are right there with him experiencing that rawness. But the physical act of the murder is only the beginning. The real punishment, the psychological descent that follows, that's where the novel really digs deep.
So it's not just a whodunit.
Not at all.
It's like a deep dive into what makes this guy tick.
Precisely. It's a psychological thriller. And Raskolnikov becomes consumed by guilt, paranoia, even physical illness. He isolates himself, even though he's surrounded by people who genuinely care for him,
So true.
like his friend Razumikin, who's incredibly loyal.
Okay.
And then there's Sonia Marmeladova.
Sonia, oh, she's such an important character, right? But before we get to her, can we talk for a second about how she's connected to Marmeladov, that drunk guy we meet at the beginning?
Oh, absolutely. So Semyon Marmeladov is Sonia's father.
Right.
And he's just completely destroyed by alcoholism. And his death, which is a pretty gruesome accident, leaves his family completely destitute.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So Sonia, in a desperate attempt to provide for her family, is forced into prostitution.
That's just heartbreaking. It's like Dostoevsky showing us this really bleak side of life in St. Petersburg back then.
Exactly. He's showing us the poverty and the desperation. But here's the thing about Sonia. Despite her circumstances, she remains deeply religious. She clings to her faith and radiates this incredible compassion.
It's almost like she's the opposite of Raskolnikov in a way.
In many ways, she is. She's this beacon of light in a world that feels incredibly dark.
So does she ever find out about the murders?
She does. She actually becomes the first person that Rodion confesses to. He's drawn to her because he senses in her a shared sense of suffering and understanding.
Wow. So if Sonia's like his moral compass, who's the detective on his trail?
That would be Porfiry Petrovich, a very shrewd investigator. He's locked in this intense psychological chess match with Raskolnikov,
Well, I love that.
using mind games and subtle hints to try and break him down.
So it's like a battle of wits.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's another character who adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Well, who's that? Arkady Ivanovich Svidrigailov.
Svidrigailov. Isn't he the one who's obsessed with Dunya? Rodion's sister. You remember well. He represents a very different kind of moral corruption driven by his own desires.
Okay, so we have Sonia, who's like the moral compass.
Yeah.
And we have this Svidrigailov guy who's like
He's like the dark side of the coin.
the dark side.
Yeah.
It's like Dostoevsky is giving us all these different perspectives on morality, making us question what's right and wrong.
Exactly. He's not giving us easy answers. He's forcing us to think for ourselves.
So the big question, of course, is does Rodion get away with his crime?
Well, he doesn't. But the punishment, as the title suggests, is about so much more than just the legal consequences. The real punishment is the internal struggle, the realization that his actions have completely alienated him from everyone and everything he holds dear.
Oh, I see.
And that's where Sonia's role becomes even more critical.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
So Sonya's incredible compassion leads her to follow Rodion all the way to Siberia, where he's serving his sentence.
Wow, that's dedication.
It really is. It's a testament to her unwavering belief in redemption.
And it's such a powerful contrast to Raskolnikov's worldview at that point, right?
Exactly. She challenges his nihilism with her faith and her insistence that even he can find forgiveness.
So we've talked about Sonya Svidrigailov. What about Dunya, Rodion's sister? How does she fit into all of this?
Dunya is a fascinating character. She's incredibly intelligent, independent, and she's fiercely protective of her family.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. She was willing to sacrifice her own happiness to marry that awful Luzhin.
Luzhin, don't even get me started on him.
Right. He's like this caricature of self-serving ambition.
Yeah, totally. And then you have Svidrigailov, who's just so hard to pin down.
Svidrigailov is a study in contradictions. He's capable of immense cruelty, but also surprising acts of generosity. He's haunted by his past, and ultimately he chooses to end his own life rather than continue down that path of self-destruction.
It's like he sees a reflection of himself in Raskolnikov, right? They're both wrestling with these inner demons.
You hit the nail on the head. Dostoevsky is showing us that even the darkest characters have layers of complexity.
Yeah, and he's really using St. Petersburg as a character too, right? It's not just the setting, it's like this oppressive force.
Exactly. St. Petersburg in the 1860s was a city of stark contrasts. You had these grand avenues and palaces, but also overcrowded slums filled with poverty and a sense of decay.
It sounds almost Dickensian.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Dostoevsky uses that backdrop to create this incredibly claustrophobic atmosphere that reflects Raskolnikov's psychological state.
So the city becomes a mirror of his inner turmoil.
Precisely. The heat, the noise, the crowds, all of it contributes to his alienation and paranoia.
It's like he's trapped in this labyrinth of his own making.
And everywhere he goes, he's confronted with reminders of his crime.
Yeah.
The pawnbroker's apartment, the police station, even the bridge where he contemplates confessing.
It's so powerful how a novel written over 150 years ago can still feel so relevant today.
That's what makes it a true masterpiece. It speaks to these universal themes of guilt, morality, and the search for redemption.
So for students of literature out there, what are some of the key things they should pay attention to while reading Crime and Punishment?
Well, first of all, pay close attention to the symbolism. Dostoevsky is a master of embedding subtle details that add layers of meaning.
Okay.
For example, notice how often characters cross bridges. Bridges represent choices, transitions, points of no return.
Oh, that's interesting.
Also, pay attention to color, especially yellow. It's often associated with sickness, guilt, moral decay.
So it's like a whole other language within the novel?
Exactly. And secondly, pay close attention to the dialogue.
Okay.
Dostoevsky uses it to reveal character and motivations. Notice how Raskolnikov's speech changes as his mental state deteriorates.
Right.
And compare that to Sonya's words, which are filled with compassion and religious allusions.
It sounds like this is a book you could read multiple times and still discover new things each time.
Absolutely. It rewards close reading and analysis. Don't be afraid to engage with the philosophical and psychological ideas in the novel.
So it's not just a good story, it's a challenge to our thinking.
Exactly. Crime and Punishment is a journey for the reader as much as it is for the characters.
I'm hooked. I can't wait to find out what happens to Raskolnikov and everyone else.
Well then, let's dive into the resolution of Crime and Punishment and see how Dostoevsky brings this complex narrative to a close. Her dedication is amazing. It really shows how much she believes in the possibility of redemption.
And it's such a contrast to where Raskolnikov's head is at right
Exactly. He's all about nihilism, and she comes in with this unwavering faith that even he can be forgiven. It's really powerful.
Okay, so we've talked about Sonya, we've talked about Svidrigailov, but what about Dunya, Rodion's sister? Where does she fit in?
Oh, Dunya. She's a force to be reckoned with. She's intelligent, independent, and she is so protective of her family.
You definitely see that.
I mean, think about it. She was willing to marry that creep Luzhin just to help her brother.
Ugh, Luzhin.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was just the worst.
She's like the embodiment of self-serving ambition, right?
Totally. And then you've got Svidrigailov, who's like this whole other level of complicated...
Svidrigailov is a puzzle. He does terrible things, but then he also shows these glimpses of generosity. He's clearly haunted by his past, especially the death of his wife, and in the end, he chooses to take his own life rather than continue down that dark path.
It's almost like he sees something of himself in Raskolnikov, you know?
Yeah.
They're both struggling with these internal demons.
That's a great point. Dostoevsky is showing us that even characters who seem purely evil have this depth to them.
Yeah. And he's also using St. Petersburg as more than just a setting, right? It's like this character in itself.
Absolutely. St. Petersburg in the 1860s was a city of extremes. On the one hand, you had these grand avenues and palaces, but then you also had these slums where poverty and decay were everywhere.
It's like something out of Dickens.
Exactly. And Dostoevsky uses that setting to create this suffocating atmosphere that mirrors what's going on inside Raskolnikov's head.
So the city becomes a reflection of his mental state.
Exactly. The heat, the noise, the crowds, it all adds to his paranoia and alienation.
And no matter where he goes, he can't escape the memory of his crime.
Right. The pawnbroker's apartment, the police station, even that bridge where he thinks about confessing, they all become these reminders of what he's done.
It's amazing how a book written so long ago can still resonate with us today.
That's the mark of a true masterpiece. It speaks to these universal themes of guilt, morality, and the search for meaning.
So for anyone listening who's thinking about reading Crime and Punishment, what should they look out for? What will help them understand it better?
Well, first of all, pay attention to the symbolism. Dostoevsky is a master of using subtle details to create layers of meaning.
Okay, like what?
For example, notice how often characters cross bridges. Bridges represent choices, transitions, moments of no return.
Interesting.
And pay attention to colors, particularly yellow. It's often associated with sickness, guilt, moral decay.
So it's like a secret code within the novel.
Exactly. And secondly, really listen to the dialogue.
Okay.
The way characters speak reveals so much about them. Notice how Raskolnikov's speech changes as his mental state deteriorates.
Right.
And compare that to Sonia's language, which is full of compassion and references to her faith.
It sounds like you could read this book a dozen times and still find new things.
You absolutely could. It's a book that rewards close reading and careful analysis. And finally, don't be afraid to grapple with the big ideas in the novel.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky is dealing with these profound questions about morality, free will, and the nature of good and evil.
So it's not just a good story, it's a challenge to our thinking.
Exactly. Crime and Punishment is a journey for the reader as much as it is for the characters. It stays with you long after you finish the last page.
I'm ready to hear how it all ends. How about you?
Let's delve into the resolution of Crime and Punishment and unravel that ending.
Okay, so we followed Raskolnikov through the crime, the guilt, the whole psychological mess. But how does it all end? What happens to him?
Well, the ending of Crime and Punishment is really interesting. It's not like a simple happy ending or anything. It leaves you with a lot to think about. Raskolnikov confesses to the murders.
He does.
He does. And he's sentenced to 8 years of hard labor in Siberia.
8 years? That doesn't seem that bad considering he, killed 2 people.
I know it seems kind of light, but remember, the physical punishment is almost beside the point. The real punishment for Raskolnikov has been all that internal torment, the guilt, the paranoia, the mental breakdown he's been going through since the murders.
Right.
But Dostoevsky doesn't just leave him in Siberia to rot Sonia with her huge heart. She follows him.
She does.
Yeah, she goes all the way to Siberia with him.
Wow, that's some serious dedication.
It really is. It shows how much she believes in him and in the power of redemption.
So she's like his lifeline in this bleak place.
Exactly. At first, Raskolnikov is still resistant. He's holding on to his twisted justifications for the murders. But slowly, through Sonia's love and her faith, he starts to change. He starts to really understand the gravity of what he did and to accept responsibility.
So it's not like an overnight transformation.
No, not at all.
So,
It's
yeah.
a long and painful process. He has to let go of his pride and his arrogance. He has to come to terms with the fact that real freedom comes from accepting the consequences of his actions and asking for forgiveness.
It's a really powerful message that even after committing such a horrible crime, there's still hope for redemption.
Exactly. And that's what makes Crime and Punishment such a timeless novel. It's not just about a crime and a punishment. It's about the human condition, about good and evil, and about the possibility of change.
And we see all of that reflected in the other characters too, right?
Absolutely. From Luzhin, who's all about self-interest, to Svidrigailov, who's this tormented soul, each one of them represents a different aspect of this moral spectrum that Dostoevsky is exploring.
So for your listeners who are planning to read Crime and Punishment, any last pieces of advice?
Yeah, I'd say pay attention to the little things. Notice how Dostoevsky uses symbolism and the setting to reflect the characters' states of mind. And really listen to the dialogue. The way people talk tells you so much about who they are and what they believe. And most importantly, don't be afraid to think about the big questions that the novel raises. This is a book that's meant to make you think.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything in this deep dive. We've talked about the plot, the characters, the symbolism, the whole shebang.
We've gone deep.
We have. But Crime and Punishment is really a book that you have to experience for yourself. It's a journey into the darkest parts of the human soul, and it will stay with you long after you finish reading it.
And as you read, I hope you'll keep in mind those big questions about morality and justice and the possibility of redemption that Dostoevsky is wrestling with.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Crime and Punishment. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit inspiring. Until next time, keep exploring, keep thinking, and keep reading.